Welcome back to Social Studies 20. Today we are going to look at a quick source. It is another source related to the French Revolution, although it does continue to be relevant later in the course as we study ultranationalism under Hitler in Germany and under Stalin in the USSR. Let us begin. How do you unpack a source that this time is a quote? I would always suggest read it through one time to get the big picture. The state determines all that is morally, socially, and materially valuable. Therefore, it has the right and obligation to monopolize all power and authority, controlling all aspects of society. The state functions as the protector of citizens, providing them with identities, welfare, and security in return for loyalty and obedience. No rights or freedoms should exist apart from service to the state. Individuals and groups constitute one unified, integral whole, working towards common goals. So after you look through it one time to get the big picture, so big picture things that might be playing in my head right now, the source is communicating about the relationship between citizens and the state, between people and the state. That might be big picture what I'm seeing here. And then being that our course is about nationalism, I might be thinking, how does this connect to nationalism during different periods of the course, during different sections of the history that we study? Now, we begin the course by looking at the old regime before the French Revolution. So before the French Revolution, then I might be asking myself, what was the state? King Louis XIV once said, "I am the state," when he was an absolute monarch, suggesting that he had all authority as he was chosen by God. So in the context of King Louis XIV, when he says, "I am the state," then when it says the state determines all that is morally, socially, and materially valuable, then in that context, it is the king. So during the old regime, it is the king that determines all that is morally valuable. So then we might pause and say, what might be immoral that would be furthered during the old regime? What would be a moral that would be relevant then, that would be promoted by the king then, but may not be promoted after the French Revolution? What would be a social value or a material value that might have been prevalent during feudalism, that might not be prevalent after the French Revolution or during the French Revolution? So when we unpack the language, we might, what we call, further the perspective that is being presented. So when the voice behind the source declares that the state determines all that is socially valuable, we can infer, because it's not outright stated, we can infer that in feudalistic France during the old regime, that a social value that was promoted by the absolute monarch would be a social value might be traditionalism. The idea that the social classes, the first, second, and third estate, are quite rigid, that there was no social mobility, rather that you were meant to continue, as Edmund Burke said, continue to honor the great chain of being that you were born into. So social value wouldn't be to see dynamic change, but rather seeing that you are static, that you are committed to continuing the legacy of those before you. Therefore, it has the right and obligation to monopolize all power. So then again, we'd pull out the language. When the source says all power, we can infer that it's suggesting the three roles of government: the legislative, judicial, and executive roles. And when it says that the state has the right and obligation to monopolize all power, if we're talking about monopolizing the power in the hands of one autocrat or one monarch, like King Louis XIV, then we know that there'd be an opponent to the voice behind the source. People like Montesquieu would argue that when the authority and the power is centralized into the hands of one, then we are vulnerable to the tyranny of government. So we would have an moment of opposition there, that the second claim in the source, therefore it has the right and obligation to monopolize all power and authority. Montesquieu would argue that that this is not going to lead to a ideal relationship between the government and governed, because it puts too much authority in the hands of one or a select few, and in that case there's no opportunity for check and balance on that authority, and will be subject to the tyranny of government. It has the right and obligation, right? So there's a tone there. There's been many words already in the first two sentences that has tone. The state determines all that is morally, not some, but it determines all. So the word all has an absolute tone. The state determines all that is morally, socially, and materially valuable. Not just some. It's not just sometimes the state will weigh in. It's going to be ever present. Therefore, it has the right and obligation. So you might have a right to do something, but an obligation is a call to action, meaning that it's not just that the state can do this, it's the state has to do this. So when we unpack the source, we unpack the significance of language. When the source says that the state has an obligation to do this, it's suggesting that the state doesn't have a choice, that they must function in this role. Now, thinking back to our cast of characters, we might say that this echoes the sentiment of Thomas Hobbes. Why might the state have the obligation to monopolize all power and authority? Well, they have the obligation to monopolize all power and authority because the nature of mankind. Because, as Hobbes observed, man by nature is aggressive, and we are violent, and we have a tendency that, in the absence of authority, to live at a state of war in nature. So why did we enter a social contract into a government? We surrender our natural freedom for the security that we crave that is only possible under the absolute authority of government. So when it says, therefore, it has the right and obligation to monopolize all power and authority, Hobbes would continue that the reason why it has the obligation is as a corrective measure to try to safeguard us from our own human nature. The state functions as the protector of citizens, providing them with identities. So later in the course, when we study Nazi Germany, when we study Stalin's Soviet Union, we'll see how identities are provided for, especially the youth in those countries, through programs like indoctrination, through the curriculum, through youth organizations like the Hitler Youth, that those citizens were given identities, and they were not allowed to have an identity separate from the state. As Sorel and Schopenhauer Gentile would argue, that we must submit to the state. Mussolini says everything within the state, nothing outside the state, including your identity, that your life only has purpose when you live for the glory of the collective, of the state. So again, the sooner we can gather our cast of characters, then we can apply their ideological perspectives to the one presented to us, and we can find nuances of who we're seeing here. When the source says obligation monopolize all power, that echoes the sentiment of Hobbes in reflection of our failed human nature. When it says providing them with identity, that's similar to the policies of indoctrination that we'd see under totalitarian ultranationalist leaders like Adolf Hitler or Benito Mussolini. But it also says the state functions as the protector, providing us welfare. So that's curious, because how do you define welfare? So sometimes when we unpack these sources, we ponder, what does welfare mean? Is this an economic term? Are we talking about guaranteed housing? Is this an economic term that's talking about guaranteed employment? Is this a social term? Are we talking about social welfare? Are we talking about political welfare? And can you have political and social welfare when the role of citizens seems to be to submit, and security in return for loyalty and obedience? So in that second part of that sentence, we have, what is the role of citizen? So often some themes we see in 20 and 30 are, what is the intended role of government? What is the intended role of citizen? The intended role of citizen here is we must be loyal to the state. We must obey the state. And the intended role of the state, of the government, we provide you identity, we provide you security, but we also provide you welfare. No rights or freedoms should exist apart from service to the state. So there's an interesting connection there to the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen, saying that such declarations are less important than actually understanding not your right, but your responsibility. And that's going to come out of the French Revolution, the idea that, a declaration is a great document, but we also have to look at the responsibility we have to one another so that we can function in society. Individuals and groups constitute one unified, integral whole. Guess what that means? That's a nation. When the source says individuals and groups constitute one unified, integral whole, they're talking about a nation working towards common goals. Now, again, going back to the beginning, if we're looking at this from the eyes of King Louis XIV, we wouldn't be seeing it as, this is a nation. It'd be more of a collection of subjects, because he's not trying to breed nationalism. He's trying to continue feudalism. But from the perspective of a radical, a member of the Jacobin, like Robespierre, Danton, Desmoulins, they might say that, this is how we might be able to achieve something more. So this is just meant to be a next step. We have a much more detailed document that you're going to see next that is going to go through another cartoon, another quote, and going to go into more detail as to the steps we can do to unpack it. So this is just more of an introduction to get you more familiar with an A1.